And if you look at the data in the last 3 years, we are seeing more or less a stagnation, a better situation than 2 years ago, but a slightly worse situation than last year. Why is this the case? Well, one of the major reasons for this situation is that we are not decreasing emissions from the built environment, but there is rather an increase. Compared to last year, we see an increase of around 1% of the combined operational and the embodied CO2 emissions associated with the built environment. What you see on this graph is the approximate split between direct, indirect, and embodied emissions. And you see that there is a stagnation or actually a slight growth. And now the total amount is around 12 gigatons of CO2, which is caused by buildings and construction related activities and by the operation of buildings. When we look at sub-indicators on that topic, when we look only at the operational emissions, we actually see that operational emissions have now reached a new record high. The dark blue line shows you where we are today in terms of gigatons CO2 with operational emissions, and the light blue line below is the ideal decarbonization path. And you see a gap there of 3.5 gigatons of CO2. And that means that they are actually 56% higher than where they ideally should be. And when we look back at the last decade, we see that this gap has increased by an average of 34% year on year. In order to get back on track, which is actually possible if we bend the current trend curve, we need to make sure that the operational emissions from buildings are reduced by more than half until 2030. So this is a very big task. It's an ambitious task, but we know that technologies are there to deliver that if the policy framework is supporting that big achievement and that decarbonization pathway. We see in principle that the energy intensity of buildings is moving in the right direction. And there the gap between where we are today and where we should be is only a difference of 13%. So we are seeing a decreasing energy intensity year on year, even though compared to last year there is a stagnation, which again is expressed by the dark blue line in this graph. The light blue line is the ideal pathway on which we should be. So this is a real dilemma, but at least we're moving in the right direction. We need to make efforts to accelerate the decrease of energy intensity, meaning we simply need to accelerate the fact that we use less kilowatt hours per square meter of built space. Another very important driver for decarbonization is, of course, to increase the renewables share in final energy demand in buildings. What we are seeing there, that since we measure since 2015, the share of renewables in buildings has increased by only 4.7%. This is disappointing because we know the technology is there, and it results in a gap of 15.5 percentage points. So ideally we would see a much higher share today than what we see in reality. And again, the gap has increased year on year by an average of 33%. So the growth of renewables in final energy demand in buildings has simply been too slow, which means that we need to make a bigger effort to have renewables roadmaps for heating and for cooling. And we need to have more effective policies to phase out fossil fuels in total. Now, let me have a look at the energy efficiency investment combined with investments and renewables and electrification in the built environment. So what we are showing here is a combination of investments which decrease the carbon impact, the climate impact of the built environment by improving energy efficiency, by increasing the share of renewables, and by increasing the electrification share in buildings. What we see here is that the investments have increased by 5% in 2024, which in principle is really good news. But we also know, if we compare that increase of 5% to the increase in the last years, this increase is slower than in 2023. And going forward, we are projecting only an increase of 3% in 2025. The bar graph also shows you where the investments are happening. You see the split between the United States, China, Europe, and the rest of the world. And if you compare the size of the bars, you will see that most of the investments are happening in Europe. Europe is investing more in efficiency, renewables, and electrification than China, and more than the United States, and more than the rest of the world. However, also the European investments are not seeing a significant growth. And therefore, we need to accelerate the investments. They should ideally be a lot higher than what they are today, which means we need to have a bigger focus on developing sustainable finance mechanisms for decarbonizing buildings and construction. Let me turn your attention to the question of whether there are significant policies implemented by the countries, by the governments around the world to accelerate decarbonization of the built environment. We looked at the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, and we analyzed them with the question whether they offer detailed policies, detailed timelines, or financial plans to decarbonize the built environment. I know that many NDCs have been published and submitted literally in the last week. We do not include those in our analysis. We have a cut-off date of around 10 days ago. So in order to have a fully updated picture, we would have to look at the very latest submissions, but that was simply not possible for the presentation of today. But we will definitely do this for the publication of the Global Status Report in 2026. Now, when we look at the situation, we find very few countries which provide really extensive details on how to decarbonize the built environment. What we see is that since 2024, around about 70 governments have adjusted or updated their NDCs concerning buildings, and that round about 26 NDCs right now provide extensive details. Many of the NDCs provide information on energy efficiency. Some provide information on energy efficiency and adaptation strategies for the built environment. Some have only very limited reference to decarbonizing the built environment. And actually quite a lot mention the built environment not at all. As I said, the NDC analysis has to be updated with the latest submissions, which we will do. But the overall picture, which ideally should show a much more extensive coverage of the built environment sector in NDCs, is rather disappointing because only 26 NDCs at this moment have extensive details on how to decarbonize the built environment. looking at the question how many countries have mandatory building energy codes, we find that 95 countries have those codes, which is in principle a really positive development, but very few of them are really aligned to the net zero carbon goal. Many countries have mandatory energy building codes for all buildings, but some only have them for some building categories, and many countries actually only have voluntary building codes. So if we look at the overall picture, we actually see a relatively good situation in the OECD countries. We also see a lot of updating happening of codes since 2024, which you see as the orange lines on the map around countries or around jurisdictions, because in particular in the United States, a lot of code updates have happened on the subnational level, that is on the US state level, since 2024, which as such is actually encouraging news. We also see a lot of code updates in Europe. We see that in Japan and in some subnational jurisdictions in India as well as in Australia. So all these are positive developments. We see a political dynamic in updating the building codes, but as I said, not many of them are really aligned to a net zero carbon standard. All this means that we need to accelerate our action. We are in many ways on the right track, on a good path, but we are not seeing that good path already translating into a real decrease of CO2 emissions associated with the built environment. So we are recommending 6 essential actions which the sector should take to get back on track. The first one is to reactivate the progress which we have earlier seen to reduce energy intensity in the built environment so that we achieve at least 25% less energy intensity by 2030. The second one is that we really need to accelerate the adoption of renewable energy. I shared with you that we are seeing a growth, but the growth is too slow. And we think that on-site generation should triple to 18%, and that we should have a total renewable energy use of 46% by 2030, which is a significant increase from where we are today. We also think that in particular the major emitters and the G20 governments need to adopt mandatory zero-emission building standards as soon as possible, and the latest by 2028. And with upgrades and pathways for all other countries to be developed by 2030 and 2035. On the topic of whole life carbon, which I did not really cover in this presentation, but which will be covered in the forthcoming global status report, is that we think that we need to adopt embodied carbon limits in building codes, at least for new countries, at least for new buildings, and that all other countries should also promote low carbon materials as much as possible. We should ensure that the major emitters and the G20 governments deliver priority actions and commitments as they express them in initiatives such as the Buildings Breakthrough and the Déclaration des Chaillots, and that these commitments should be really visible in the NDC 3.0 submissions, and that these major emitters and the G20 governments really track the progress on their commitments and publish the progress on their commitments. And finally, it is absolutely necessary that the global building energy efficiency investment doubles by 2030. And for that, we need to leverage public and private funds, and we need to have the right financial instruments in place which achieve that doubling of the urgently needed investment. And with that, I would like to close my presentation. As I said, we will publish the full global status report on buildings and construction issued by the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction in 2026. and I look forward to that and engaging with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we can applaud. I'm not sure that Oliver is going to hear us, but but he saved his GHG by not coming here. I don't know if it's a. I've been discovering that just like you have. I'm maybe going to call you both on stage, Adair and Anne, so that we can continue this discussion. These numbers are a little, how would I say, maybe a little depressing. I don't know what, I know I have to keep the microphone this way. Even if the numbers are depressing, I have to keep the microphone high. And not depressing, but clearly I'm keeping repeating the same thing. We are discussing here, but we are only touching. We are a drop of water compared to the flow of unsustainable investment in buildings, and we are still kind of whistleblowers at the moment when we all know that real estate is a major economic question. Major. Real estate is half of the global wealth. It's not nothing. Half of what we collectively possess, and I'm always referring to myself. Maybe some of you do the same. It's 100% of what I possess, and I've been renovating my house in the suburbs of Paris, and by renovating my house and putting insulation inside, because it's a house with I cannot do it from outside because it would be really ugly. So I did it from inside, and just not taking into account the cost of the works and materials, I've lost 6 square meters. It's a 120 square meter house, and I've lost 6 just because of the insulation. I've been spending 30,000 euros on nothing just because I'm insulated. So why should I do this? Why should the people do this? That's always a question, and we know that we are advocating for that. But if we cannot answer this question, if we cannot provide the solutions, we will never do it. We will never do it if we don't touch housing. Housing is 60% of what. Housing is 60% of the buildings, and housing is households. It's one person by one person we have to convince to do works, or convince, or whatever, carrot and stick. Well, anyway, that's personal reflections. I'm not adding to. I don't want to add to the depression here, but I think it's really something that we should take into account. So we have some brilliant panelists here, and I just want to, as it's really to take stock of what is actually happening on. It is very important. Probably these data should be more granular, because of course the question is very different from one continent to another, one region to another, from one country to another. So we should get into more granular. But globally, we can see the big figures. So I want to ask you, and I'm going to ask you a first question, which is maybe how do you react to this, or 2 questions. The other question would be, what is the emission gap report saying regarding buildings? So how can we articulate all these data together, and that is what is the complementarity of 2? So pick one of the questions, the first that you want, and then we'll come back for the second question, because I'm going to ask exactly the same question to Adair afterwards. Okay? You need to do like that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks. No, first of all, let me say that actually brilliant presentation, very important findings, and I see that very much as a sectoral mirror of what we have just found, the new key findings of UNEP's emissions gap report this year. Because what we do see is that rather than decreasing, emissions continue to increase. we saw globally emissions increasing to a new record of 57.7 gigatons of CO2 equivalents in 2024. It was a 2.3 increase from 2023 levels. And overall, we also see that the new NDCs are insufficient, collectively insufficient, to really put a bend in the curve as we need it. What we see right now is basically similar gaps in ambition and in action. But what we also see, and I think that's important to highlight, and which also came out quite clearly in this presentation, is that basically we do know what we need to do. We do have the solutions to actually get on track to achieving the goals that we've set ourselves, both globally and for the specific sectors. And most of these options are really low cost. It's not as if it's like outrageous or really high cost. So what we need to focus on now, and including here, while we're in Belém, is how can we then spur the action? How can we make sure that we provide the enabling frameworks and the incentives to really spur further action? Last year's report, we don't include much on buildings specifically in this year's emissions gap report, but last year we showed huge sectoral mitigation potentials, including for buildings by 2035, that are basically very well aligned with what we just saw in this presentation. So I would just emphasize we need to focus on how can we spur the action, also as summarized in the 6 key takeaways in the presentation.
Well, first of all, can I say great to be here in this incredibly badly named cooling pavilion. But this issue of buildings is hugely important and it's often underlooked. It was one on which the Energy Transition Commission, which I chair, produced a major report in February this year, looking at all the different aspects of buildings. And I think it's important to say, and you mentioned the word granular, it's important to understand how this differs between different regions in the world. So there is the biggest demand, operational demand for buildings, is heating. That's where the biggest energy demands are. Not terribly important here in Belém. Cooling at the moment is significantly smaller than heating, but of course it's where we actually...
We must admit we have sustainable heating here. It's
we do have
passive heating.
Sustainable heating, yeah. So there are very different challenges in different countries. The other thing which we found in the report was that it's very important to get granular enough to work out where does buildings fundamentally depend on what is happening in other sectors of the economy for its decarbonisation, and in particular the power sector. Now these numbers are concerning, but I'm willing to bet that a significant element of why we have had that increase in operational emissions is the following. Cooling demand is going up rapidly, in particular in India and China. And at the moment, that cooling demand is being met by electricity, which has a carbon intensity of somewhere between 600 and 900 grams per kilowatt hour. If the power sector were already decarbonised, we would be much less worried about that cooling demand. Similarly, in embedded emissions, the embedded emissions in construction, that is totally dominated by 2 things, by steel and by cement, concrete. And the crucial thing there is for us to decarbonise the production of steel and cement. So there's a lot of things that happen in buildings which are not going to be controlled in the building sector. But I then think it's very important for us to get down to the bits which the building sector can itself control. And those are the following. 1, electrifying heat. 2, increasing the efficiency of already electrified appliances, including in particular aircon. And 3, improving insulation standards, which I always think is important not just for total energy demand, but for peak electricity demand. And I don't think we often focus enough on this issue of peak electricity demand. It's the fact that cooling booms in India and China have created peak electricity demand, which has driven up new investments in coal to meet them. So if we can invest much more effectively in cooling, you don't get those increases in peak demand. And one of the most important things is actually also by smart buildings, time of day electricity grids, to enable people, plus insulation, enable people to move their electricity demand away from peak. Because we have to remember that in our electricity systems, a hell of a lot of cost and a hell of a lot of the emissions are driven by peak electricity demand, not average electricity demand. So those are some of the ways that I think we've got to get more granular in really understanding the particular nature of the problem and the different levers which can attack it.
Yeah, thank you for this. I would come back to passive solutions because, of course, energy demand is important, but one of the challenges that we have collectively is to lower the energy demand.
Yep.
And to ensure that the energy goes to the most effective and efficient place where it's needed. I mean, wasting energy to cool buildings or to heat buildings that could be passive is really an absurd way of doing things. And we are really here at Global ABC trying to advocate on that, because this is the only way to. I mean, if there is we need to get energy for producing things, for elevating the level of production, give this energy to the real sectors that need energy and not to use it in buildings. And this is quite a challenge. And this is, as you said, this is a small, apart from the existing buildings, which is a question, but in the new buildings, it's a small overcost. And we need to also to advocate for that, which is not easy.
Do you want me to comment on that? Look, I think this distinction between existing buildings and new buildings is fundamental. The economic analysis that we did shows that when you're talking about new buildings, with good regulation and building design up front, actions can pay for themselves and significantly reduce the energy demand either for cooling or for heating. And these go from some very, very simple things like painting roofs white, not a dark color, has an enormous effect. They include other things which move from the building itself to urban design. And I think we have a major adaptation problem across the world about how we're going to make cities in hot parts of the world livable, and we've got to think about greening them and creating natural passive cooling of cities. But broadly speaking, wherever we have new build, we ought to be able to build to much higher standards than we do at the moment. The economics of retrofit are much trickier, and it sounds like you're finding that in your house in Paris. And indeed, sometimes people say we ought to be getting everybody to be doing deep retrofits, passive housing standards. Our analysis said that that is unlikely to pay off where you are retrofitting existing buildings.
No.
What you need to do
don't
is
say
focus.
that. I just did it.
What?
Just don't
Well,
say
no,
that.
you may have done it,
Yeah,
but you're rich enough to do it for the good of the planet rather than for the good of your budget. But if we're talking about, the mass of ordinary people who are worried about energy bills, I think a message that they've got to spend a hell of a lot of money on really, really deep retrofits is not going to work. What we've got to do is get them to focus on the specific forms of retrofit which do have a very significant payoff. And there are some which are relatively low cost and relatively big payoff. And by the way, what we've also got to kill is the idea that the only way you can have a heat pump for your heating is to have an incredibly well insulated house. I have a house in the middle of the British countryside. I've done some obvious things like, insulation in the roof, double glazing, etc. But it's not an absolute passive house by any standards. But I put in a heat pump and it still pays for itself. Heat pumps work even in moderately insulated homes. We mustn't make the best the energy of the good.
Yeah, I would like to maybe step to another side, which is adaptation, because buildings, of course, we don't see it really there, but I just want to have your point of view of this question of adapting buildings to extreme heats, and also to all these questions within the GAP report, or out of your knowledge on that.
So the emissions gap report actually doesn't go much into resilience issues, but it is a key focus of UNEP more generally. Also nature-based solutions, especially for cities, showing the many obvious choices also for making cities more livable in a hotter future. And I think that's also really important. You already made this distinction, Adair, between what is needed in the short term to get on track, which the presentation also focused on, but also what is needed now to avoid further lock-in of high carbon-intensive buildings and low efficiency in the future to get to basically zero carbon in buildings by 2050. And there I think resilience plays a huge role as well, and is something that, you know, we experience it here. You said that it's the hottest pavilion at the COP. It's only going to get worse.
Yeah, I think we need to conclude more. We need to conclude now. I just want to have one word from you on how these reports can be at best turned into advocacy. Because obviously we struggle in terms of advocacy for buildings. It's just like something that we're circling around since years, and we are just like shouting in the desert and saying desperately. We are making progress, but I want to know, from your point of view, how can we best use your knowledge and this knowledge to advocate and to leverage on that?
Well, look, let's be clear. We have a communications and a politics issue. It's quite easy for a politician to understand the objective of increasing the percentage of passenger cars which are electric. They can say, I want that to be 30%, I want it to be 70%, and they measure the result and they see it. It's quite easy for a politician to say, how many solar PV panels can I have? How many wind turbines? These are easy things. And policy, they're easy things to understand. And there's an interesting feature in the world that policy migrates to addressing things which are easy to understand. And this building decarbonisation challenge is much more complicated to understand. But we've really got to start convincing people that it is possible to make a big difference. And I actually think the interface between the adaptation and resilience and the mitigation agenda is an important way forward here. Convincing people, in particular in hotter developing country parts of the world, that there is a huge challenge in making the future environments livable, and that making them livable will also make them more efficient and therefore bring down the emissions, and that this is a win-win agenda in that space, I think is one of the ways that we can maximize the ability to win an argument in an area which is just inherently complex.
Totally agree. It's all about making things simple and something that people can relate to, politicians, but also all of us normal people. So it is really about coming up with a message that also brings out the opportunities, the benefits. Why should we do this? It makes sense, and relate it to something that is important to people even now. And totally agree also on the interlinkages between mitigation and adaptation here. That could be important driver.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I think I cannot express how much it is important to have this firm ground to build on. We are builders here, and we know that we have to dig to the firm ground to find a place to step on and to build on both advocacy and policies, because what we need is facts, and you are collectively providing facts, which is very important. So thank you for that. I'm going to pass the floor to Hong Peng for words of conclusion. I think or you have a last word to say, or no? Okay. So I'm going to pass the floor to Hong Peng for a few words of conclusions, and thank you again for your brilliant contributions.
Thank you so much. It was a very nice discussion, and I think it is very clear. It's not only the hate here, it's all the evidence, science. The emission gap report, the global status report of building, and also anti-transition committees report all have told us we are not taking this sector, which accounts of about 1/3 of the global carbon emission, in the right way. I mean, in terms of how to address, how address the emission growth in the sector. I started my career over 20 years ago, working on building sector, promoting building efficiency, renewable. Back then, it's a similar challenge. Why many people don't really understand the importance of this sector, and we are still facing the similar challenge in a global level, in the country, in the local, in the cities, etc. I think we need to think harder how to really tell the story in a more, impactful way. But anyway, I think the good thing is we have all the solutions how to really close the gap for the building sector. It's a building code and efficiency, renewable, and of course the circular construction. Of course, we need to find a way to engage the government, private sector on the financing model, etc. We need to work on capacity building, technology transfer, etc. But we have solutions there. We just need more actions combined with the national, state, and the city, facilitated by global partners. So I really want to hope we can work together on this super important sector. Please come to us, no matter it's Lord Tuner's Energy Transition Committee or UNEP. Thank you so much, Annie, my dear colleague, and of course our global ABC for global convening, knowledge sharing, and go deeper to countries, to cities, to see some real actions. We are here to support you, and thank you again for joining this event. I look forward to seeing you in many other events, and more importantly, to work together to really promote the low carbon transition of the building sector. Thank you.
Thank you, and of course the Buildings Pavilion is here for you, and people are still being around, so please, if you have some specific questions, address them to us, you. You are all, well, in the room. If I have a look around, I see only experts, so please, they are all experts from Global ABC. We are all under a common umbrella here to discuss and find some solutions. Thank you for that, and thank you for our excellent panelists again. Have a nice day. And get a little fresh air.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Good. Anyway, best of luck.
Update or development.